Latin America, a region rich in natural resources, vibrant cultures, and a diverse population, has long been plagued by economic underdevelopment and social inequality. Despite the potential for growth and prosperity, it seems trapped in the status of the third world or developing regions. There are several intertwined reasons for this, ranging from historical and cultural factors to economic policies, governance, and systemic issues like corruption and inequality. In this video, I will go through 10 reasons why Latin America seems that will always be a third world continent. However, besides all this, there's still hope. So watch until the end to find out. Colonial Legacy. One of the most significant factors behind Latin America's chronic underdevelopment is its colonial history. The region was colonized by European powers, primarily Spain and Portugal, in the 15th and 16th centuries. During this time, the colonizers extracted vast amounts of wealth from the region in the form of gold, silver, and agricultural products, leaving behind a legacy of exploitation rather than development. The colonial powers imposed a social hierarchy based on race and class, with European settlers at the top and indigenous people, along with African slaves, at the bottom. This created deep-rooted inequalities that persist to this day. Post-colonial Latin American states inherited fragile economies, dependent on raw material exports, and political systems that prioritized elite interests over broader societal development. Economic dependency and export economies. Many Latin American countries have traditionally been dependent on the export of a few commodities, such as oil, minerals, coffee, or bananas. This has left their economies vulnerable to fluctuations in global markets. When prices for these commodities drop, entire economies can collapse, leading to poverty, unemployment, and political instability. Additionally, the focus on raw material exports means that many countries in the region have not diversified into industries that can drive long-term economic growth, such as manufacturing, technology, or service sectors. Instead, they remain reliant on external demand and foreign investment, which often leads to exploitation rather than sustainable development. Political instability and corruption. Political instability is a recurring issue in Latin America. From military coups to dictatorships, the region has experienced continuous disruptions to democratic processes. Governments have often been short-lived, with frequent changes in leadership leading to inconsistent policies. This instability discourages foreign investment, stifles domestic entrepreneurship, and leads to mismanagement of resources. Corruption is another key issue. In many Latin American countries, corruption is deeply entrenched in political and economic systems, diverting public resources meant for infrastructure, healthcare, and education into the hands of elites. This prevents the state from effectively delivering services that would raise living standards and promote development. Scandals, such as the Petrobras and Odebrecht cases, reveal how corruption has penetrated even the highest levels of government across the region, undermining trust in institutions. Social inequality and the elite capture. Latin America is one of the most unequal regions in the world. Economic inequality, a holdover from colonial times, has persisted for centuries, creating a wide gap between the wealthy elite and the poor masses. In many countries, a small percentage of the population controls much of the wealth, land, and political power, while the majority struggle with poverty, limited access to education, and healthcare. This elite capture of resources means that reforms aimed at addressing inequality and promoting social mobility are often blocked or watered down. The wealthy elites, with their significant influence over the media and political systems, resist policies like progressive taxation, land reform, or investments in public education, which could help lift large portions of the population out of poverty. Cultural factors, discipline, and work ethic. Cultural elements also play a role in perpetuating underdevelopment. In many parts of Latin America, there is a perception that discipline and work ethic are not as highly valued as they might be in other regions, such as East Asia or Western Europe. This can be tied to a broader historical context where innovation and entrepreneurship were not emphasized due to the colonial focus on extraction. In comparison to other developing regions like East Asia, which experienced rapid industrialization through a culture of hard work, savings, and educational investments, Latin America has been slower in adopting these values on a large scale. Crime and violence. Crime and violence are significant issues across much of Latin America, particularly in Central America and parts of South America. Gangs, drug cartels, and organized crime contribute to high levels of violence, making the region one of the most dangerous in the world in terms of violent crime rates. This violence not only affects people's quality of life but also stifles economic growth by discouraging investment and tourism. High crime rates are often tied to economic inequality, unemployment, and the failure of the state to provide basic security and justice. Weak institutions and corrupt law enforcement agencies exacerbate these issues, leading to a vicious cycle of poverty and violence. Education and human capital. One of the most overlooked but crucial factors is the lack of investment in education. While some countries like Cuba and Uruguay have made strides in education, many others lag far behind. Access to quality education is limited, especially in rural areas, and there is a significant disparity in educational outcomes based on socioeconomic status. Without a strong focus on education and skill development, Latin American countries struggle to build the human capital necessary for modern, high-tech economies. This keeps the workforce largely unskilled and trapped in low-paying jobs, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and underdevelopment. Debt and IMF conditionalities. Many Latin American countries have taken on massive amounts of foreign debt, often to fund infrastructure projects or stabilize their economies in times of crisis. However, repaying this debt has placed a heavy burden on these economies. In many cases, countries have had to implement austerity measures, as required by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, which has led to cuts in social programs, healthcare, and education. This has sparked social unrest and further hindered long-term development. Weak infrastructure and inefficient bureaucracy. Another significant issue hampering Latin America's development is its underdeveloped infrastructure. Many countries in the region suffer from poor roads, outdated rail systems, inadequate ports, and unreliable energy supplies, all of which impede economic growth. Without efficient transportation networks, moving goods within and outside of the country becomes expensive and time-consuming, limiting competitiveness in global markets. Furthermore, many urban areas are plagued by informal settlements lacking access to basic services such as clean water and electricity. Coupled with this is the region's notorious bureaucracy. Government processes are often slow, inefficient, and heavily regulated, creating significant red tape for businesses. Starting or expanding a business in many Latin American countries can be incredibly burdensome due to complex regulations, licensing requirements, and corruption. This stifles entrepreneurship, innovation, and foreign investment, all of which are critical for economic progress. Environmental degradation and mismanagement of natural resources. Latin America is home to some of the most biodiverse regions on the planet, such as the Amazon rainforest. However, the mismanagement of its natural resources is a significant factor holding back its long-term development. Deforestation, mining, and industrial agriculture have led to massive environmental degradation, which threatens the livelihoods of millions and depletes resources for future generations. Moreover, while the region is rich in resources like oil, gold, and agricultural land, these assets have often been exploited by multinational corporations or domestic elites with little regard for the environment or local populations. Instead of investing the revenue from natural resources into sustainable development, much of it is siphoned off through corruption, tax evasion, or used to fund short-term projects rather than long-term infrastructure and social improvements. Environmental mismanagement also results in long-term economic damage, with climate change, droughts, and natural disasters exacerbating poverty and reducing agricultural output, particularly for poorer communities. The failure to balance economic growth with environmental stewardship only deepens the region's structural challenges. Despite the many challenges that have kept Latin America in a state of underdevelopment for so long, there is reason for hope. In recent years, there has been a growing awareness among the people of the region that real change cannot come from outside forces, but from within. Across Latin America, movements for social justice, economic reform, and environmental protection are gaining strength, fueled by a desire for a better future. Citizens are increasingly holding governments accountable, demanding transparency, and calling for stronger institutions. Grassroots organizations, community leaders, and young people in particular are realizing that if things continue as they have, the cycles of poverty, inequality, and corruption will persist. More and more people are recognizing the need to act collectively, take responsibility for the future, and make decisions that benefit society as a whole, rather than just a privileged few. There is a renewed focus on investing in education, building sustainable economies, and protecting the environment for future generations. While the road ahead is long and complex, the seeds of change are being planted. As Latin American nations begin to embrace the importance of community, civic responsibility, and shared growth, there is hope that the region can break free from the constraints of its past. By learning from previous mistakes and striving for a more just, inclusive, and united future, Latin America has the potential to chart a new course toward progress, stability, and prosperity.